Henry VIII was England's biggest monarch. Literally, the once handsome, charming prince turned into an obese, cruel tyrant. The heartthrob of the Tudor dynasty died a paranoid, sickly recluse. Now, a team of experts uncovers the mysterious diseases that defeated one of England's most powerful kings. King Henry VIII dies in the early hours of January 28, 1547, weighing nearly 400 pounds. Doctors report that he has badly ulcerated legs. He's unable to walk. His eyesight is fading. And he's plagued by paranoia and melancholy. These and other medical records provide fascinating insight into the body and mind of one of the most notorious monarchs in England's history. Today, a team of experts is reopening Henry's case file. Historian Lucy Worsley, Henry biographer Robert Hutchinson, and medical doctor Catherine Hood. They'll look at the historic symptoms of the Tudor king, conduct experiments, and set up a virtual autopsy of Henry VIII. They'll dissect Henry's life, from the young Tudor prince to the obese king, to find answers to his biggest medical mysteries.
The big question for me is why his wives found it so hard to conceive. Was it Henry's fault, and did he have syphilis?
And why was he so incredibly fat? When he died, he was clinically obese. Could this just have been overindulgence, or did he have diabetes?
And the other mystery was what kick-started those chronic personality changes he suffered in his 40s. Was this down to some rare hormonal disorder, or was it his jousting injuries which were the cause of all his awful medical problems?
And the team will tackle the biggest question of all. What killed Henry? The health of Henry VIII isn't just personal, it's political. In Tudor times, the king's health is a matter of state.
Henry's health was of paramount importance because it was a political issue. It was important to his government, and it was important to his friends and enemies overseas. That's why the foreign ambassadors at his court kept a very close watch on his movements and his health. Every cough and sneeze was reported. Henry's health was the health of England.
These detailed ambassadors' reports and the Tudor physicians' notes held at the British National Archives are crucial evidence for the investigation. The reports list Henry's many symptoms. The team begins with the reports of Henry's birth. Henry is born on June 28, 1491. He's the third child. The Tudor dynasty is still young and under constant threat from claims to the English throne by rival camps. In order for the dynasty to thrive, each Tudor king must be strong and produce male heirs. According to records, young Henry is well-built and healthy.
A graceful little boy, his bearing so gallant, his skin so fair, his smile so frank.
The first report we have of medical problems affecting Henry's life was when his father contracted a fever. We now know it was probably tuberculosis.
Tuberculosis mainly affects the lungs. It's caused by microbacteria that spread through the air when infected people cough, sneeze, or spit.
These days, a patient with TB will be isolated until they're on treatment to try and prevent the spread of the infection, and we give them several weeks of antibiotics. But in Tudor times, there was no cure.
Experts believe that Henry's father may have passed his infection on to his children, including his eldest son and heir, Prince Arthur.
Arthur contracts a fever, wastes away, and dies. It's a great tragedy for the Tudor dynasty, and the young Henry, at the age of 10, is now next in line to the throne.
Henry's father dies of disease, and Henry is just 17 years old when he becomes the second Tudor on the English throne. There's no evidence that Henry ever caught the tuberculosis infection. It's the first of many lucky escapes to come. The young Henry is strong and excels in medieval sparring. All of the commentators note that he's a healthy teenager when he becomes king. For the next 5 years, he thrives. But Tudor England is plagued with disease. The lack of sanitation and the open sewers are a fertile breeding ground for rats and other disease carriers. Henry's first recorded illness comes 5 years into his reign.
The king is indisposed with a fever. Opinions are divided as to what caused the ailment.
Today, it's believed that his fever was smallpox.
Smallpox starts with an extremely high fever, and then an itchy rash appears. Then the distinctive pussy spots start to outbreak, and these can leave scars.
Smallpox is a viral infection transmitted through the air. Today, it's kept under control through vaccinations. But Henry has no such help. Even so, he manages to recover from the fever in another lucky escape. Proof again that the young king is strong and healthy. But 6 years later, when Henry's almost 30 years old, he falls ill with another fever.
The king caught a fever which grew to 2 tertians and paroxysms. He is also troubled by pains in the head.
This time, Henry's got malaria. Today, it's an infection usually associated with the tropics. But in Tudor times, malaria was endemic in England.
Malaria comes from the Italian word meaning bad air, because it was believed we could catch the disease from evil humors in the atmosphere. Today we know that, of course, it's spread from the bite of the mosquito. In Tudor times, the disease was endemic because we had much more marshland in this country then, the ideal breeding ground for mosquitoes.
The symptoms of malaria are cold shivers, high temperatures, and sweating. Now, the symptoms tend to come back every 3rd or 4th day, and each attack lasts about 8 hours.
From 1521 onwards, Henry VIII's medical records show that he suffered from repeated bouts of chronic malaria. Not very nice.
Henry VIII battled smallpox and won. But malaria proves a more difficult enemy. The infection settles inside him and becomes chronic. It sets off a deep-seated paranoia in the king.
Henry lives in permanent fear about catching a disease. He's already lost his own father and his brother to infections. He now becomes paranoid about diseases. He becomes obsessed with his own health. Today, we'd call him an out-and-out hypochondriac.
His own fear of disease affects the entire court. Whenever there's any sign of infection, Henry orders his court to move from one palace to another.
It was the doctor's duty to inspect all of the courtiers for suspicious pock marks or a nasty cough, and if they were found to be sick, they were expelled from the court. No excuses. This applied even to the most important people.
Tudor England is a minor power at the start of Henry's reign. But Henry is determined for England to succeed at any cost, even his own health. A team of experts, historian Lucy Worsley, Henry biographer Robert Hutchinson, and medical doctor Catherine Hood are investigating the medical history of King Henry VIII to determine what turned the charming prince into a despotic tyrant.
So we've discovered that Henry had a paranoid fear of disease, but his strong constitution helped him recover from smallpox and malaria.
The dashing and sporty prince is a celebrity across Europe. Documents show foreign ambassadors gushing in their praise of his stunning physique.
His Majesty is the most handsomest potentate I have ever set eyes on. Above the usual height, with an extremely fine calf to his leg, and a round face so very beautiful it would become a pretty woman.
The armor Henry wore throughout his life provides a fairly accurate idea of Henry's actual body size. Each set of armor was measured to custom fit Henry. Henry is 6'1", but the average Tudor height is only around 5'6". The king towers over everybody else.
The thing that I really like in the accounts of him is the way that they often go on about what good legs he had. It's the calf of his leg that several of the ambassadors actually comment upon.
In Tudor times, a man's beauty is measured, among other things, by the shape of his legs. Calves are a symbol of Tudor manhood, and Henry works his assets to his advantage.
Henry rules at a time when the image of the king sets the tone for the whole nation. The Tudors were as image-conscious as we are today. There was no better way for Henry to show off his strength and manhood than by competing in public sports displays.
In archery, in wrestling, in joust, Henry was a match for the best in his kingdom. None could draw the bow, tame the steed, or shiver a lance more deftly than he.
Jousting is the perfect way for Henry to show off both his own strength and England's power. But it's a dangerous sport, and Henry puts his life on the line.
The first of the really nasty jousting accidents we hear about was in 1524. And what happened was that he forgot to put the visor down on his helmet. Everyone was shouting, "Put your visor down!" But he thought they were just cheering him on. So out he went, he charged his opponent, and the lance hit him just here over the right eye. It's a really nasty knock. And from this point on, we start to hear that he suffers from these horrific, really bad migraine headaches.
Henry is extremely lucky. He could have lost his eye or been killed altogether. The resulting migraines torture Henry for the rest of his life. Henry is also an avid player of royal tennis, a mix of squash and court tennis. It's a very strenuous sport. Henry builds one of the first royal tennis courts in England at one of his favorite palaces, Hampton Court. Like any modern-day athlete, Henry is plagued by sports injuries. His first tennis injury is a wrenched foot.
One accident we hear about happened during a game of tennis in 1527. He wrenched his foot, and it must have been pretty bad because for several weeks afterwards he had to wear a black velvet slipper instead of a normal shoe. And what happened was that all the other courtiers started wearing slippers as well in sympathy for the king.
In the span of just a few years, Henry suffers a head injury, wrenches his foot, and probably injures his thighs, all in the name of being seen as a physically strong and able king. Then, at the age of 36, Henry suffers another setback.
He started having real medical problems with his leg, problems that were going to plague him for the rest of his reign. In 1527-28, Henry was on a royal progress, and he was confined to bed with a sore leg, almost certainly a varicose ulcer, probably caused by the constrictive nature of the garters he wore.
Henry's fashionable garters endanger the health of his prized calves.
Because of the bad circulation, the blood can't get returned to the heart, so it builds up in the vessels and then leaks out, causing the ulceration. Even with modern medicine, it can take a long time for a varicose ulcer to heal, as we encourage the skin to regrow. In Tudor times, infection would have been a real worry, as this could lead to blood poisoning.
The team questions how Henry's doctors would have treated his ulcers and his chronic headaches without modern technology.
Henry was much more than the handsome sporting star. He was the true Renaissance prince. He's interested in science, in astronomy and geometry. But most of all, he loved medicine. He founded the Royal College of Physicians, and he developed his own ointments and cures for the host of diseases which afflicted Tudor England.
Steve Bacon has researched some of the ointments that Henry VIII himself devised, including something called the King's Plaster.
This one is actually called the King's Majesty's Own Plaster and is in a manuscript in the British Library. Here's one I made earlier.
Henry devises this plaster as a treatment for ulcerous legs, maybe even his own.
And there we have it, the King's Majesty's Own Plaster.
Henry's plaster contains over 25 ingredients. Some, like lead, are highly poisonous and may have ultimately contributed to his own death. The greatest challenge facing King Henry VIII's doctors is trying to understand what is happening inside his body.
Tudor medicine is still based on the ideas of the Roman physician Galen. He said that the body's made up of 4 different tumours, and if these get out of balance with each other, it can cause illness. So Tudor doctors are very keen on investigating the fluids that come out of the body, like Henry VIII's spit, also his urine, also his stools. They spend a lot of their time actually looking into the toilet to see what the king has produced. Tudor doctors are even encouraged to taste urine to see if they can work out what's wrong with somebody. It must have been a really, really horrible job.
Henry's doctors inspect his fluids daily, often several times a day. The traditional cure for anything that afflicts Henry is bloodletting, often with the help of leeches. Steve Bacon shows how the process works.
So if we take the lid off the box to give our little babies a chance, and we'll see about applying one of them. This one looks like he's particularly keen, doesn't he? So let's see.
Bacon applies young leeches to a volunteer to demonstrate how Tudor surgeons would have bled Henry VIII of evil humours.
Those nice veins there, one from the head. Oh, look at that. He's going to bite straight in. Oh, he's definitely biting in. How does it feel?
Tiny, tiny little pinprick, I can feel.
Henry's doctors would have applied more than one leech. There were over 55 bleeding points. The aim was to drain at least a pint of blood.
When he does let go eventually, you're going to carry on bleeding, I'm afraid, because he's put an anticoagulant into you. He'll let go, you'll carry on bleeding, the blood will run, and then I can actually collect the blood in a bowl such as this.
Each of Henry's bloodletting sessions lasted a couple of hours.
Well, I think it's probably about time we detached it, so we'll use a little bit of saline just to encourage him to let go.
Whoa, whoa. Oh, he's enormous. Look at that. Oh, and it's still bleeding just underneath.
Henry was bled regularly, both as a preventative measure and also to treat his many ailments, like migraines.
So you can really see the difference in size here. This one is the unfed one, and this one has just been fed.
Henry, now in his mid-30s, has got a major problem. He desperately needs a son. Without a male heir, the future of his Tudor dynasty looks more and more uncertain. The team turns to Henry's poor reproductive record.
So this is Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, and this here is her childbirth record. It's really pretty sad. We know about 7 pregnancies. The first one in 1510 was stillborn. The next one dies. The one after that is premature. another stillborn baby. Then there's a live birth. This is Princess Mary, who survives. But after that, another miscarriage, and then a baby girl who died young. What could have caused that?
Well, it's really difficult because in Tudor times, antenatal care wouldn't have been that great, even for someone of the royal household. But the thing that strikes me is she was able to get pregnant, so, you know, fertility was not her problem.
The lack of sanitation may explain Catherine's bad childbirth record. But some believe there might be another explanation: syphilis.
Syphilis is an infection that can cause problems around childbirth, and if the infection gets passed from the mother to the child, it can cause stillbirth, it can cause premature birth, and it can cause early infant death.
Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease. It's first recorded in Europe around 1495.
Syphilis was a very well-known disease to the Tudor doctors. They termed it the Great Pox. The cure for it was mercury. Hence the saying, 5 minutes with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury.
Mercury is a Class B poison. In Tudor times, the mercury treatment lasts 6 weeks, during which time the patient is usually confined to bed.
Why on earth did they treat them with mercury? Well, it made the patients salivate and sweat, and Tudor doctors believed that this was part of the healing process because it cleansed their patients of the bad humours affecting their bodies.
The syphilis pustules, called gumata, cover the whole body and cause the flesh to rot. But in some patients, syphilis can lie dormant for many decades before it breaks out.
Henry could have been a carrier of the infection, passed it on to his wives through sex, who then in turn passed it on to their children without anybody knowing about it.
Did Henry have syphilis?
Henry's doctors would have spotted those telltale symptoms, the gumata on his skin. No record of that. There's no record either of mercury being supplied to those royal doctors. That terrible mercury treatment would have taken 6 weeks when Henry would have been out of the public gaze. No record of that either. So as far as I'm concerned, this is case not proven.
Henry is now 40, and his body has already taken a beating. But in a few years' time, an accident takes him to the brink of death. Experts, historian Lucy Worsley, Henry biographer Robert Hutchinson, and medical doctor Catherine Hood are investigating the medical history of King Henry VIII to find out what turned the charming, sporty prince into an obese, despotic tyrant. Henry is now in his mid-40s and still hasn't produced a male heir. It's a big hit to the Tudor dynasty, and an even bigger hit to his male ego.
One of the things that amuses me about him in this period is just how much attention is given to his manhood. That is a ridiculously big codpiece.
That's just propaganda, both personal and national propaganda. The Tudors invented propaganda. It's all about creation of this powerful nation state off the coast of Europe. So Henry personified that. It's the image he wants to project of a strong, vibrant nation. And the splendor of his court, and the splendor of his clothes, and the size of his codpiece is what it was all about.
The codpiece can't hide the fact that time is running out for Henry and his first wife, Catherine. Henry wants a new wife who will bear him a male heir. But first, he needs a divorce.
Henry came up with a radical solution to get the divorce that he wanted without having to ask the Pope for permission. He made himself the head of his own church, granted himself the divorce that he needed to marry wife number 2, Anne Boleyn.
Henry divorces himself from Catherine and England from the Catholic Church.
Henry is not just a physically imposing figure. He's imposed his political will, his new wife, his new church on England.
By the age of 44, Henry is married to his second wife, Anne Boleyn, who's expecting their second child.
His reformation has caused uproar at home and overseas. It's crucial, it's vital that Henry should present himself as the strong political leader in full control of the situation.
Henry decides to demonstrate his political strength with a stage-managed sports stunt. On January 24th, 1536, the king competes in a jousting tournament. It's a day that will change the rest of his life. Documents report there's an accident on the field. Henry is thrown off and crushed beneath his horse. He loses consciousness for 2 hours.
The king mounted a great horse to run at the lists. Both fell so heavily that everyone thought it a miracle that he was not killed. But he had been for 2 hours without speech.
It's a major catastrophe. In order to determine just how big the collision was, the team sets out to restage the moment of impact.
What I thought is if you could bring the pig here, stretch him across...
Royal Marines trauma surgeon Mike Edwards leads the way.
So Mike, what's this experiment you've got set up for us?
What we're going to do today is we're going to try and recreate the trauma incurred on Henry VIII's body during an accident he had when jousting in 1536.
So how's it going to work?
Well, what we have to do is we have to find something that represents King Henry VIII. And for the purposes of this experiment, we're going to use a pig carcass of equivalent weight. We're going to bring the pig and we're going to put it on here like this. And then we are going to get a very heavy weight attached to this crane here. And then we're going to drop the weight on the pig.
This simulates the impact of the horse collapsing and crushing King Henry VIII.
And what does this represent in the experiment?
For the purposes of this experiment, this represents King Henry plus his armour, plus his horse, plus the horse's armour. And I've calculated that to be approximately, give or take a few pounds, £1,500.
It's the equivalent of 8 washing machines collapsing on Henry.
And I'm hoping that if we have a look at the pig carcass after it's been squashed, we will see what sort of bony injuries or soft tissue injuries might have been inflicted on Henry as a result of this accident.
The 1,500-pound weight is lifted 14 feet above the pig's carcass to simulate the velocity and weight impact acting upon Henry's body during the jousting accident.
Go on then, you're going to do this, you're going to give the signal?
I'm going to give the signal.
Go on then.
3, 2, 1, release the weight!
Oh, that looked like that hurt.
That's gotta hurt.
Now just imagine if we were the courtiers and that was Henry VIII, we'd think that he was a goner.
I think so. I think if the crowd had witnessed this sort of event, seeing their monarch squashed beneath his horse...
It would have gone really quiet now, wouldn't it?
The index for Henry, that's what they would have thought.
In modern terms, Henry's body experiences the effects of a 40-mile-per-hour car crash. He only survives because he's fully armored.
Right, if you look at the skin here, you can see how it's all ripped and torn. Well, this is just a reflection of the underlying soft tissue injury. Now, poor old Henry had varicose veins, and he had tissues that didn't heal very well. Now, you can imagine, if he'd had this sort of a soft tissue injury, what a bother he would have had to get them healed afterwards. Varicose ulceration makes healing very difficult indeed. So if he'd had anything like this, he'd have been in months and months with open wounds.
We know that he was without speech, he was speechless for 2 hours. And we're thinking that meant he was probably unconscious for 2 hours, and that's perfectly predictable under the circumstances, you'd say.
He could have had what's known as a diffuse axonal injury, which compares the brain to being shaken around very suddenly as he came to a halt from 25 miles an hour to nothing. His brain would have been rattled round inside his skull, and there could have been possible damage to the brain.
If Henry's accident was even half of that bad, it must have been a pretty major event in his life, don't you think?
I'd say it'd be a very major event in his life. Absolutely certain.
When news of the accident reaches Henry's pregnant wife, Anne Boleyn is so shocked that 3 months into her term, she miscarries. The child is male and would have been the son and heir Henry so desperately needs. The experiment helps the team to better understand the full extent of Henry's injuries. The accident damages Henry's legs and reopens his ulcers. It also causes a major head injury, which leads to a substantial loss of consciousness.
He can't speak for 2 hours, maybe he's unconscious for 2 hours. Is that a really serious medical problem?
Oh yes, I mean these days we would consider a loss of consciousness of over 5 minutes as being indicative of serious head trauma. So 2 hours is a long time to be unconscious for.
There are reports of a personality change afterwards, where he becomes more erratic and more tempestuous in his moods. Could that be caused by the accident?
Well, there are reports of people having a personality change following a serious head trauma, particularly if the frontal lobes are affected, which are the part of the brain that control your mood. So it is quite possible.
The jousting accident may have injured Henry's frontal lobes, the brain's center for emotions and personality. Henry's contemporaries observed the king's increasingly unpredictable mood swings.
The king had a very mal d'esprit. He was irascible, unpredictably moody, often in a different opinion in the morning than after dinner.
Henry's doctors are unable to diagnose Henry's head trauma, but they do try to treat Henry's badly ulcerated legs, now much worse since the accident.
The man in charge of Henry's ulcerous legs was Thomas Vickery, the doctor who'd successfully healed them already in 1527. But the trouble now, after the jousting accident, was that every time Henry's ulcers healed, he actually got worse. Contemporary reports said that he was near death.
The king has had stopped one of the fistulas of his legs, and for 10 to 12 days the humours which had no outlet were like to have stifled him, so that he was sometimes without speaking, black in the face, and in great danger.
Henry's leg bones are also probably injured and may have developed bone infections that fester underneath the ulcers. This explains why even after the surface ulcer heals, Henry falls seriously ill. To keep Henry from blacking out, his doctors decide to keep the ulcer open and maintain it as a running sore. They cauterize the ulcers with burning hot irons. Henry's legs are now continually infected until his death in 1547. The badly ulcerated legs start to smell like rotting flesh. It's reported that you could smell the approaching king even when he was 3 rooms away, but no one dares to tell the king that he stinks.
The king has the worst legs in the world. Those who have seen them are astonished that he doesn't stay continually in bed, judged that the least exertion could be dangerous to his life, yet no one dare tell him so.
Henry's team of doctors, now numbering 15 royal physicians, struggles to find the cures for their increasingly impatient patient.
The other thing that must have been really difficult as Henry's doctor was running the risk of committing treason. Because if anybody said that the king was going to die, to predict the king's death was a treasonable act and you'd be punished for that. So as a doctor, you've got to be very careful. It means you can't tell the truth.
Today, doctors would attempt to amputate Henry's severely infected leg. But in Tudor times, amputating a limb is a very dangerous operation.
The first tool that would be used in an amputation is this. This is called the dismembering knife. It's a large, curved knife. And the way that it's used is that it is wrapped around the patient's limb and drawn around in one swift movement. If the surgeon is skilled, he should have cut through the skin and through the muscle and be down to the bone. The knife, of course, won't cut through bone. For the bone, you need the amputation saw. This is a capital amputation saw. Large and heavy. It would have been a very expensive tool. Hence these rings, so that you can actually hang it up so that it doesn't get too rusty. This would be applied to the bones, long strokes cutting down through the bone until the limb is separated. A good amputation surgeon at this time is one who could remove a limb as quickly as possible, preferably in under a minute.
Only 10% of Tudor patients survive an amputation. It's no wonder, then, that none of Henry's royal physicians dare to suggest it. It probably would have killed the king. Historic reports at the British National Archives show that Henry's ill health impacts all of England.
In the years following the accident, Henry becomes the cruel despot. So different from the young gallant prince of his youth, so different from the popular idea of bluff King Hal, Henry becomes the Joseph Stalin of England. Henry's brutal suppression of the monasteries, his execution of friends, allies, wives, is ruthless and single-minded. It's estimated that as many as 70,000 of his subjects died at his hand or through his laws.
By now, Henry is a far cry from the athletic young king he used to be. He's become a cruel tyrant. The jousting accident seems to have changed Henry's body and mind forever. But there may be a more deadly disease that eventually kills him. An expert team is investigating what went wrong for England's fattest king, Henry VIII. They've discovered that his jousting accident in 1536 was a major turning point in his life, causing serious head trauma. The injuries to his legs made them severely ulcerated. Henry, once the great sportsman, can no longer exercise. He piles on the pounds. The measurements taken from Henry's custom-made armor highlight the dramatic change. The team casts two body doubles, one representing the young Henry in his 20s when he became king, and a second, older Henry in his 50s. Henry is 6'1", but between his 20s and his 50s, his waistline balloons from 32 inches to 52 inches. And his chest expands from 39 inches to 53. Without exercise, Henry turns into England's fattest monarch, weighing nearly 400 pounds. He's a binge eater and snacks for comfort. He often suffers from constipation. How much did Henry eat?
I'm here to do Henry's weekly shop. So he had 13 dishes a day, and one of those was often a pork dish. 7 days a week, that's a lot of pork, that is.
Henry's diet consists mainly of meat dishes. He eats everything from pork, lamb, chicken, and beef, to game, rabbit, and a variety of birds like peacock and swan.
So, we're not getting any water because that's unsafe to drink, but the Tudors got around this by drinking an awful lot of ale. 10 pints a day, we think, for Henry VIII, so we need 70 pints. 70 pints of ale, but that's not all. Okay, red wine, we need lots of this. Henry's red wine would have been quite sharp. We probably wouldn't have liked it very much, but he didn't mind it being sharp because he drank it with sugar in it. And this is the absolute staple of the Tudor diet, bread. And in Henry VIII's case, white bread. Not good for his constipation.
It's been calculated that Henry eats 5,000 calories a day, twice the recommended intake for a man today.
Right. Ooh, watch out, watch out. Here we go. Not picking up any vegetables because Henry wasn't keen on his 5 a day. All this stuff was food for peasants, and also the Tudors didn't like eating raw vegetables. They thought they were indigestible. Well, no vegetables for Henry, but he really liked strawberries.
Henry eats approximately 20 grams of salt per day, more than 3 times the recommended amount today.
Here's Henry's food. The duck, the guinea fowl, venison burgers, more pies.
Henry goes overboard. He eats oily red meats, lots of sweets, a large amount of alcohol, and hardly any vegetables. His diet is deficient in vitamin C.
Do you think this is too much meat for one man to eat, then?
It is.
What kind of health problems do you think someone will get if they ate all this meat?
Heart problems.
Heart problems?
Yeah.
So what's the damage?
£484.
Wow, that's quite a bit. That's just one man's food. And most families today are spending about £150 on a week's food.
But the real damage isn't to Henry's wallet. It's to his internal organs.
There we are.
So what can we see here then, apart from this nice thick layer of fat?
Well, there is indeed a huge layer of subcutaneous fat here. But what really strikes me is how the heart is having to work very hard here. It's actually working quite fast. And because he had high blood pressure and poor circulation, and because he was so big, the heart would have become quite enlarged, particularly on the left side, which is the part that pumps the blood around the body. And also it's having to go quite fast to make sure that the blood gets to the extremities.
What's that? Is that his liver?
That is his liver, and it's looking a little bit fatty, as you might expect from his diet and also his alcohol consumption.
Today, Henry would be diagnosed as clinically obese. This puts him at great risk of developing high blood pressure and type 2 diabetes.
Catherine, for me, there's loads of evidence that Henry VIII suffered from diabetes. What do you think?
And you're absolutely right. If he were to walk into my clinic today, I'd want to test his blood sugar, which is something, unfortunately, the Tudors couldn't do. He has all the classic appearance of a late-onset diabetic. He's obese, he's got chronic leg ulcers, he's got poor eyesight, he's got terrible circulation and high blood pressure.
The Tudor diet at court, a lot of meat, not many vegetables, a lot of sugar. This is probably something that I think he brought on to himself. Do you agree?
Well, you're right. These days, we would always advise a diabetic to cut sugar out of their diet, because one of the problems with diabetes is your body can no longer use glucose very well, and so you have to cut way back. But that would have been incredibly difficult for him to do in Tudor times. And so an awful lot of his problems could well have been caused by the diabetes.
Well, I'm convinced. For me, it's diabetes, case closed.
Type 2 diabetes may have been one disease Henry VIII didn't manage to escape. Throughout his life, Henry battled malaria, chronic headaches, ulcers, and survived. He abused his body trying to portray himself as a healthy, sporty king. But the jousting accident of 1536 may have cost him dearly. It may have damaged Henry's frontal lobes and aggravated his ulcerated legs. His once active lifestyle gave way to signs of type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure. The once dashing King Henry became a comfort-eating, paranoid recluse.
It's hard to imagine the pain that Henry must have experienced on a daily basis. There were the migraines, fever attacks. He was carrying all that weight around, and his doctors gave him horrendous treatments on his ulcerated legs every day. It must have been really horrible being trapped inside that diseased body.
Henry can't hide his deteriorating mind from the prying eyes of his court. His public image is crumbling.
The king was in ill humour and taking medicine. He broke into tears at the Privy Council meeting, and he took such grief that of late it was thought he had gone mad.
That old ogre Henry eventually dies dumb and friendless at 2 o'clock in the morning of Friday, the 28th of January, 1547. His obese corpse stinks. He dies a paranoid recluse. There's one final indignity. There are reports, horrible reports, that Henry's bloated 28-stone corpse explodes in his coffin before the funeral. So here we have a king obsessed with his public image of strength and imperial splendor, hardly going out in a blaze of glory. Oh, how the mighty have fallen.
The investigation is complete, but its conclusion is somewhat tragic. To keep the Tudor dynasty alive, Henry VIII became obsessed with his public image.